Good morning. We'll get started here. My name is Sarhang Hamasaeed. I'm the Director of Middle East Programs here at USIP. I'd like to thank you all and welcome you all to USIP this morning, and welcome those who are joining us through our live stream. This event is a public event that is live streamed, as I mentioned, and we have a hashtag for those who want to tweet and join the discussion through social media. Hashtag Raqqa USIP, and you can see it on the screen. For those who are new to USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace was created by the U.S. Congress in 1984 to focus on the proposition that peace is possible, that peace is practical. And USIP has been working on Syria and has programs in Syria. We focus on three key categories of work there. One, we try to inform policy discussions on Syria, and this event today and this discussion is part of such efforts. Second, we work on building Syrian capacity for preventing, mitigating, and resolving conflict through nonviolent means, and we support facilitated dialogues on the ground, and we have done such in northeastern Syria, in the Al-Hasaka province specifically. We experimented with a dialogue model that we have more widely used in Iraq. We tested it in northeastern Syria, where we bring different actors to a conflict together through a process of facilitated dialogue. And usually the outcome of that is preventing tensions, and it also contributed to the return of internally displaced families, specifically in Al-Qahtaniya, or also locally known as Turbaspi. We have expanded that line of work to Tel Hamis and Ras Al Ain. The third aspect of our work is to work on the spillover effects of the Syrian conflict, and we have used our grants mechanism to support initiatives in Jordan and Lebanon to focus on the issues of refugees and host community tensions, and those efforts have been informative, again, to inform policy discussions here in Washington. For the conflict, or the conflicts in Syria, I should say, there are many angles that we can tackle this issue. But for today's purpose, the angle that we focus on is the liberation of Raqqa and post-ISIS governance and stabilization in this area, which is the military advances and triumphs is important, but stabilizations and governance, as many argue, is probably more difficult. And I'm sure we will expand to other aspects of the Syrian conflict, the future of the political framework at the national level, the role of regional and international actors, including the United States. And for this discussion, we have a very distinguished panel, and I'm really honored to join them here today. First of all, we have to my left Mona Yacobian, who is the USIP Senior Advisor for Syria, the Middle East, and North Africa. She was with USAID before she joined us, and she has extensively written and worked on the region, including Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan. And her excellent special report on Raqqa and the governance challenges is an important topic that will be a key aspect of the discussion today. And then we also have Hassan Hassan, who's a senior fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, a think tank in Washington, and he is very well known for his work on Syria and on Islamic militants and his bestseller, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. I cannot recommend enough that book and the positive feedback that I have received in every discussion about ISIS and the conflict in that part of the world, in Syria and in Iraq. And we're also joined by Nicholas Heras, who is a fellow at the Center for a New American Security, and he is working in the Middle East Security Program. He has a decade of experience also on Syria before the uprising of 2011 and after the events that followed. He has also published a lot on this topic. He is a respected scholar on this, and he has been tapped by many organizations and agencies in the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and the media as well. Again, what we are starting out with, I will start with a set of questions to our panelists, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones on both sides of the room, so when you have a question, please come to the microphone, and I'll remind you about that when we get there. But without further ado, I'd like to turn to Mona, and if you could set the stage for us. Post-ISIS Raqqa, why is Raqqa important? What are the key challenges that we should be thinking about, and what are some of the policy considerations that we should look into?
Thanks so much, Sarhang, and good morning. Thank you all for coming. I have to say, I think that in some ways the importance of Raqqa and its liberation got lost a bit in the sort of warp speed news cycle that we all are subjected to. And so I welcome the opportunity this morning to really drill down and try to understand better the significance of the fall of Raqqa, what the challenges are that we face with its liberation, and in particular what role the United States can or should play. The liberation of Raqqa, I think, marked a significant watershed in the military campaign to defeat the Islamic State. Raqqa's importance really cannot be overestimated. I think we have to remind ourselves this was the capital of the so-called caliphate of the Islamic State. It occupied a central role in ISIS's narrative, this sort of utopian in their view, or dystopian in our view, reestablishment of the caliphate across Iraq and Syria and perhaps even beyond. It was also a location where we know external operations planning took place, particularly with attacks in Paris and Brussels. This was a significant strategic and symbolic loss for the Islamic State. When we couple it with the fall of Mosul, just a few months prior to that in July, I think this constitutes a seminal moment in the campaign to defeat the Islamic State. But I also think it's very important to acknowledge that with these military wins, the ultimate defeat of ISIS is still far from assured. And I think that is because what takes on even greater importance is what happens after the dust clears or the smoke lifts from the battlefield. And that's really what the meat of the special report is about. It's about the governance challenges that are faced in Raqqa, in particular, after the Islamic State. I think what we've learned, I hope lessons that we've absorbed from experiences in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, is that what is central to anchoring military victories, to consolidating gains on the battlefield, is the establishment of effective governance. Governance that is inclusive, accountable, and responsive to local populations. It's really a critical hedge against the return of violence and extremism, effective governance. Without it, I think what we've seen is oftentimes these military victories are fleeting. So in looking at this question, specifically in Raqqa, I sort of found that there are really four baskets, if you will, of challenges to achieving effective governance. The first, probably the most vexing, is the strategic basket. And this really essentially is an acknowledgement that Syria is still in the throes of a very complex, multi-actor civil war, now regional proxy conflict. In the absence of a political settlement to that civil war, there are all kinds of questions that are raised about what happens to Raqqa. Who will ultimately rule Raqqa? Who will have ultimate authority over Raqqa? There are a number of competing forces on the ground, both local, regional, and even global. So a slew of questions there that I suspect we're going to drill down on further in the Q&A. Another strategic challenge results from the fact, as we are seeing, that as the campaign against ISIS begins to wane, we are seeing other conflicts, subterranean conflicts, come to the fore. This could be, again, in the case of Raqqa. There's a looming conflict between the Syrian government and the Kurds, who have asserted a semi-autonomous region in the north and northeastern parts of Syria. And of course, the Kurds have played a critical role in the liberation of Raqqa. There's a potential conflict between the United States and Iran. We are seeing that Iran and Russia, of course, have played a significant role in the taking of Abu Kamal, the last remaining city that was held by ISIS on the border with Iraq, and indeed even Iraqi popular mobilization forces took part in that battle, underscoring, again, that this is a battlefield that has not just local or even regional stakes, but global stakes. So those are some of the strategic challenges. The second basket looks at or refers to the ethnic tensions that are inherent in having a Kurdish-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces. Well, and again, I think what's important here is not so much the breakdown, the percentages, what percent Arab, what percent Kurd, but who holds power, who wields authority. And up until now, clearly it's the Kurds who wield this authority. And yet Raqqa is an Arab tribal city. And again, I think we will delve into this further, but this is very different from other parts, other cities that the SDF and that the Kurds have played a role in liberating. And it sets up a clear tension between local Arab populations and Kurds that are playing a critical role in liberating the city and potentially in holding it and also in its governance. Third is the tribal issues. This is a city, as I've noted, that has a particular tribal character to it. ISIS was an adaptive and learning organization. It learned lessons from what happened in Anbar, and I think more effectively was able to exploit divisions within clans and sub-clans. And so there's a certain level already of dissonance amongst the tribes. And over the 3 years that ISIS had control of Raqqa, we've also seen a breakdown in some of the traditional tribal reconciliation mechanisms. And of course, we have the longstanding issue that we've seen in other areas held by ISIS, which is a desire to take revenge against those who allied with ISIS. So there's the prospect of tribal violence and revenge killings. And finally, last but not least, are simply the technical challenges associated with governance. It's important, I think, to mention the level of destruction in Raqqa, which is significant. It's estimated that maybe as much as 80% of the city is uninhabitable. The extent of littering of IEDs, of improvised explosive devices, is massive and will constitute a critical challenge. But then beyond that, it's the actual challenge of governing a place. And here there are issues with capacity, the capacity of the local Raqqa Civil Council. Who are the people that are in it? Do they have the skills, the technocratic skills that are necessary? And the challenges of restoring essential services, of restoring electricity, water, et cetera. The report highlights two particular areas that merit attention. One is the water and irrigation infrastructure, which is critical in this largely agricultural area. It is the lifeblood of the economy. It is essential to get some of this back going so that there is an opportunity for people to get back on their feet, that there are livelihoods opportunities there. And finally, education. which is, in many ways, I think, even more important. We are talking now about the future of Syria, about Syria's children, and again, and it's become a bit of a cliche, but it's important to note this fear of a lost generation. Over the past 3 years, many schools in Raqqa were closed. Those that weren't were taken over by ISIS, used as incubators to propagate their extremist ideology. So there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in order to reinvigorate the education sector. And also, I think it bears mention the level of trauma that those who have lived under ISIS rule have suffered from. It's reported by doctors and others to be unprecedented, particularly amongst children. And so this is going to also constitute, I think, a significant challenge. So what do we do? Why don't I just conclude with a few recommendations that I laid out. The report has a number of recommendations that are pegged to each of these baskets. I think the most important, though, is that it is critical for the United States to remain engaged on this, to maintain its light footprint, perhaps to shift a bit more from military to a posture that's focused more on stabilization and ultimately on assisting with the tasks of governance that I've laid out. But the United States has a critical role to play and should resist the temptation to sort of check the box, Raqqa liberated, and withdraw, I would say, precipitously. Second, and I think very important as well, the United States has built an important relationship with the Syrian Democratic Forces, with the Kurds that are playing leadership role there. It's important for the U.S. to leverage that influence, to insist that political authority be devolved to local populations, to the local Arab populations in Raqqa, so that you do, in fact, have inclusive governance that is representative of the people on the ground, and that is not considered the replacement of one occupying force by another. With respect to some of the tribal challenges, the report notes that, of course, across Syria, Syria's social cohesion, its social fabric, has been badly damaged. Raqqa is one of the governorates that has perhaps had the worst level of a deterioration of social cohesion. And so it's really important even now to begin to think about ideally innovate ways to engage at that local level to help begin to restore social cohesion, dialogues, and reconciliation. This is something that can begin even in internally displaced persons in IDP camps in the north. This is work that really needs to begin immediately. And then finally, on the technical side, I think it is just going to be incredibly important, in particular, to focus on the capacity of these local councils, to begin to attract some of those council members who are in exile in Turkey, who played an important role prior to ISIS taking over Raqqa and after the regime was pushed out. There are skilled technocrats that can play a role. They need to be recruited back. And again, on the issues of both water infrastructure, education, these are areas that need to be prioritized. And in particular, some of the psychosocial interventions that various aid organizations have developed, those need to be integrated across the board. And again, even beginning with people in IDP camps, dealing with some of the humanitarian assistance provision, and then further as governance and other sectoral programs begin to take shape, it's important to address the trauma that these populations have suffered. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mona. That was an excellent summary of a set of very complex issues. And just for you, we have physical copies of the report if you are interested in having picking up a copy, and also they're available online on the USIP website. So with that great introduction, I would like to go for a deeper dive, Hassan, given your experience, especially with that part of Syria. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are different angles through which you can look at Syria. The composition of the population, the character of the geographic area could give a different angle. So is there anything special to the composition of the community, the tribal structure there that is important for us to look at? And second, especially in a post-ISIS environment, for continuity of ISIS. You've written on the topic before that ISIS, even before the liberation of Raqqa, has been setting the stage for what comes after. So what can you tell us about that preparation, and what would that look like in your view moving forward?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I want to start by saying that I wasn't a big fan of the Syrian Democratic Forces for a while. I've been critical of it, but I have to say they are doing quite well these days in terms of governance, in terms of not governance as a kind of a way of doing things, but as an opportunity for outsiders, for the international community to do something through the Syrian Democratic Forces. But it needs some work. It needs some very important work. And the two things I think that need to be emphasized from the outset when it comes to the Syrian Democratic Forces, that what the U.S. should be doing is to emphasize the national character of the Syrian Democratic Forces, that it's not a Kurdish or a PKK project, but a national project that combines the Kurds and the Arabs and the other, like the religious minorities as well. And I think there is an opportunity there. In fact, it reminds me of the period immediately after ISIS took over. The opportunity, the window of opportunity you have today is the same opportunity that ISIS had after it took over all these areas, and I'll expand on the demographics and the nature of the area in a bit. And the second thing is to prevent the regime from coming to these areas, and I think that's a very important thing. You may hear people say, some people want the regime back. Some people, as we discussed before the panel, people want the return of the good state. Anything that the regime had before, the Syrian state had, except the intelligence services and their brutality. Everything else, I think people long for. They want it back because they want some sort of security. But to go back to the region, Eastern Syria in general has always been an important and a kind of a disjoint part of Syria. In Syria, we call it Al Jazeera, the peninsula, or basically the Mesopotamian sort of part of Syria, not the Levant part of Syria. Although it has, the other side of the river belongs to the Levantine or the Levant part of that region. And also in Syria, even in curriculum, so if you study like in high school, you get 3 marks kind of advantage if you get lower than what needs to be, what needs to take you to study, for example, medicine or so on and so forth. If you were from that region, you get that extra credit and they call it the distant provinces. So it is part of, it's a far part of Syria. It's disjoint. It's separate from Syria in that sense. And I say that because it has policy implications. It has popular or implications related to the popularity of certain groups that come with a project that take into account that sort of dynamic or nature of that conflict. That's why ISIS and the Syrian Democratic Forces, maybe the YPG or the PYD, have something in common. that's like a lot of people, a lot of the support they got is because they acknowledge this nature of Syria, the decentralized, the separate sort of part of Syria. People obviously don't want to partition from Syria, to leave Syria, but I think a lot of people are fed up of how they were governed badly and poorly from Damascus. Damascus is far, so the central governance in this region didn't work quite well over the years. So that's an important part as a kind of a geographic nature of the region. Locally or socially, obviously it's also different because it's a predominantly tribal areas, and there is some sort of coherence and cohesion in that region in terms of tribes. In many ways, the towns are named after or structured in a way that acknowledge the composition of the tribal composition of these regions. Raqqa is different, obviously, from Hasek and Deir ez-Zor, the other two provinces that make up what we call the Jazeera in Syria, the three provinces. In Deir ez-Zor, for example, there's one tribe that kind of makes up around 70 to 80% of the province. In Raqqa, it's different. They have different dynamics because Raqqa is similar to Dar'a, where they have smaller tribes. And you don't have like the kind of a majority tribe, a tribe that control you could say Raqqa is predominantly that so-and-so tribe. Same thing in Hasaka, and obviously these two, unlike Deir ez-Zor, have other demographics. They have Kurds and they have Christians and they have other minorities like the Turkoman and so on and so forth. In Deir ez-Zor, it's a separate thing, but it's different. They do have Christians, and but they're mostly Sunni Arabs from one big tribe in that region. And just kind of also a short history of the Syrian conflict, the Raqqa and the place of Raqqa in the Syrian conflict before the SDF came to the scene. Even when you talk about ISIS, I think we have to acknowledge that ISIS wasn't we have to understand that much of the work that ISIS did in 2013 and 14 was done for it by Jabhat al-Nusra, so Al-Qaeda style, sort of trying to win hearts and minds. That's why they started to gain some influence and build some influence in Raqqa before ISIS came in and kind of adopted a different model when they announced a unification between the Islamic State of Iraq and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and they formed the ISIS, or the Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria. So we have to acknowledge that this popularity aspect, the winning hearts and minds, was done not by ISIS, or at least the infrastructure of ISIS was done already by Jabhat al-Nusra. So ISIS had really two years. When they took over Raqqa, they took over Raqqa by force, and a lot of the people who were with Jabhat al-Nusra before defected to ISIS, and they formed the kind of the vanguard of ISIS. And when ISIS took over, a lot of people started joining them. It's a similar phenomenon to what we see today with the SDF. When the SDF takes over an area, they start to fuel and kind of recruit locally. A lot of people join them after they take a town, and these people start joining them as governors or people who work with them in terms of providing services and so on and so forth. So there was, just to go back to the beginning, there wasn't a window of opportunity for ISIS in the beginning because a lot of people saw them as different, saw them as the force that could secure an area, a region, expanding from Mosul or even further, from let's say from Mosul to Aleppo, where you could travel from one area to another without having to fear for your life. You don't have to even carry guns, unlike when the Free Syrian Army governed. Obviously, it's different when the regime governed, but it's the people lived under the Free Syrian Army or Ahrar Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, and they didn't feel safe. But when ISIS came in, they enforced a semblance of law and order, and a lot of people joined them and supported them and joined their other layers of their caliphate, rather than just the security forces, the military aspect, or so on and so forth, but joined the municipality and so on and so forth. So it expanded. At the the time because a lot of people joined them. But then when people recognized what ISIS was standing for, and when the campaign against it started, the security forces within ISIS took the front seat, and they started to crack down on people, and because they're paranoia, they start to alienate people. Now, this is a lesson for the Syrian Democratic Forces. You have a window of opportunity today where people feel this is different from ISIS. This is people who treat the population respectfully, and they're not corrupt, unlike the regime, unlike the Free Syrian Army or other forces. They're not corrupt. So they try to, as much as they can, treat people respectfully, and there's some law and order. The problem is, I don't know how long that will last. Especially when people start to feel that maybe the regime is coming back, or the Syrian Democratic Forces is a vehicle for the regime to come back, then I think, or when mistakes are made, or when there's a delay in reconstruction, I think things will start to go back to normal. And we might see Raqqa and other areas in Syria turning into another Fallujah, where it's just a cycle. You destroy a city, and then militants come back, and then you destroy it again, and the same militants come back, as if the local population didn't learn anything. And it's because of the mistakes that are made by outsiders.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated going into the diversity of these communities, because, and on your last note on Fallujah and the repeat that you have to go through, I think this is an important angle that we have seen in Iraq, where many of Iraq's issues were blamed on Saddam Hussein, but even after he was gone, other issues emerged that were just coming as a result of the change in the system, as a result of communities working with each other and having disagreements and not having a common consensus. And then that gives the space for the terrorists and militants to seize that space and take issues of the people. So with that, I would like to transition to Nick and ask you, Hassan touched on the SDF and the importance of how it needs to be promoted. I mean, you're welcome to comment on things that Mona and Hassan talked about, but I wanted to ask you to go for a deeper dive on the SDF. Obviously, the SDF has, there is the security military angle of liberating the cities and and taking hold of those areas, and then it's the politics. And this is where the tensions, as long as we have seen in the context of Iraq, there was common enemy in ISIS. The actors worked with each other and fought that common enemy. Does the SDF still have a common enemy? Can they hold together and govern? And an important component to their success and viability has been U.S. support. What do you see the limitations so far in the U.S. support through in the model that has been used by, with, and through? And going forward, what do you envisage of the U.S. role to be, especially in light of recent statements and conversations between the U.S. president and the Turkish president about stopping arming the SDF?
Well, thank you very much to USIP for hosting this event, and to Mona for this excellent report. And I think that this gets the word that I've heard frequently over the course of this panel: governance really is the heart of what will determine the war over the aftermath of the war. You know, I'll start off by saying there are three themes that I see in Mona's report that I think really ring true. One is U.S. commitment. What is the level of U.S. commitment moving forward? How does the U.S. build stability, or as General Thomas, the head of Special Operations Command, said, how does the U.S. empower the SDF to govern in the wake of ISIS, which, as he stated, sets it apart from other partners that the U.S. has had over the last 15 years. The second dynamic is the agency of local Syrian actors, in this case, the SDF, or more broadly, the Democratic Federal System, or the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, that overarching sort of governance structure that's been built out as the political component of the SDF. How does it implement all the different factors that build stability in areas that have been conquered from ISIS? These factors are security, the provision of humanitarian assistance, governance and administration, and then economic recovery or economic reconstruction. How does it do that? And how does the SDF interact with other actors, such as former members of the Raqqa Local Council, which Mona references in this report, that are either resident in Europe now or in Turkey and would like to come back and would like to contribute to the reconstruction and the rehabilitation of their home areas. And then I think the other third key point here is Turkish buy-in. And fundamentally, this feeds into the other two dynamics. All these areas that we are discussing today, Raqqa in particular, are west of the Euphrates. They are far from what we would typically consider to be the core areas of the democratic federal system of northern Syria, and this is very important. And so I'll use that as sort of the launching point. When you look at when the U.S. began to interact with the EPG, with the Kurdish, majority Kurdish armed forces, and its incipient governance structure in what it calls Rojava, or Western Kurdistan, how the Kurds conceived of their government was far more limited than we see today. They had 3 cantons, one Sizri, or what is now Haseke, what is now the Jazeera region of the federal system. The other, which was Kobani, which is now the Euphrates region of the federal system, and Afrin, that very controversial piece of territory north of Aleppo, which is in some ways the beaten heart of Syrian Kurdish nationalism. Over the course of the partnership between the EPG and its other armed actor allies with the U.S. military and the broader coalition, the range of territory that has fallen under the democratic federal system has expanded immensely. It has expanded southward all the way into Deir ez-Zor on the very border with Syria and Iraq. It has expanded, and it has expanded westward over these areas that had been claimed by ISIS. Hassan had alluded to the fact that one of the dynamics at play as ISIS began to expand its influence, as it really began to challenge for control over eastern and central and northern Syria, was that it was able to sort of stick its brand over local militias that had risen against Assad. That was a strategy that played to its advantage. It allowed ISIS to exert the minimum required force in order to hold territory and to claim a caliphate. And it was also used against ISIS as the EPG and its Arab allies in the Free Syrian Army began to work more closely with the U.S. military, began to create sort of systems of strike cells. Really, the key to the success of the SDF has been its ability, its almost uncanny ability. It's really its path-breaking ability to interact with the U.S. military and other coalition partners and to be able to call in airstrikes. And using the sort of snowball as it rolls down a hill effect of an avalanche, the SDF was able to have a type of air superiority over ISIS that played against ISIS, which allowed the SDF and its SDF to seize villages throughout this area of Syria, throughout northern, eastern, and central Syria from ISIS, to replace ISIS as the predominant power. But now there comes a governance challenge, and I think this is very important when we look at sort of the history over the last year and a half of where we are going. The first experience that the SDF had with trying to govern in the wake of ISIS was in Tal Abyad in northern central Syria, and it did not go well. And the lessons that the SDF learned from that was it needs to communicate well in advance what its intentions are for the local population, particularly because there is sort of an ingrained sense among many of the communities that the SDF is now administering, that it is a Kurdish project to try to create one contiguous territory from eastern Syria all the way to the Mediterranean, and it'll be Kurds are going to replace the historical wrong that was imposed upon them by the Arab government in Damascus. So the situation as we look at it in Raqqa right now is a model of how the SDF has had to approach governance west of the Euphrates since the beginning of 2016. Learning from the Tal Abyad experience, learning from the challenges in Tal Abyad, starting with Manbij in Tabqa, which is further west from Raqqa, and now Raqqa, there's been a key emphasis on mobilizing local council, and we see the Raqqa Civil Council as being the key sort of implementer, making sure the demographic balance of these councils is correct, building a local civil security force, and then also being willing to be flexible. I think this is going to be very important as we move forward. Where we stand right now is that there are 3 neighborhoods in eastern Raqqa that have been transitioned, and this is the key phrase, from the SDF to the Raqqa Internal Security Force, the RISF. The Raqqa Civil Council, the RCC, has authority over them, but it is in a state of having to provide clean water, food assistance, electricity, healthcare, and reconstructing homes, all in the middle of rubble. And this is the challenge. And so I think one of the key lessons that we should take from this report is that there is a model in place. The U.S. and the SDF have a model. They acknowledge that from day one, at the fall of ISIS, they had to hand over power to the Raqqa Civil Council, to responsible tribal elders, and to a security force that has been composed mainly to represent the demographic balance of the local population. But as we move forward, if the level of U.S. commitment is not there, the ability for the federal system to govern far afield from its core areas will be severely challenged. I think this is a dynamic that will require much further exploration as we begin to look at what is the long-term role of stabilizing this area of Syria, because it can't just be the federal system. It can't just be the SDF. It has to have a U.S. backbone of support, and with that U.S. backbone of support, you can bring in other partners, whether from the Gulf or potentially, and this may be me putting too much hope to the situation, a condominium with Turkey when it comes to administering areas west of the Euphrates that have been historically areas of ISIS recruitment and could potentially serve as the basis for ISIS to reconstitute itself in Syria. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And so actually where you end up, we have mic runners. If you have a question, please raise your hand and state your name and your question, and please make the question a question. One in the back over there.
Thanks, Alex Bickett, SAIS. Good to see everyone. Thank you very much for the presentations. I have 2 questions. One, Hassan, you said that the challenge for the SDF is to build a kind of nationalist identity. And I wonder what that is going to be. It's clearly not going to be a Kurdish identity, and it's not going to be a Ba'athist identity. We know that Ba'athism was taken out of the textbooks, at least somewhere near Raqqa. I'm not sure if that's across the SDF territory. But what is that national identity going to be? And I think I see no evidence that Damascus is going to offer some kind of a new nationalist ideology which is going to bring people in a way that Baathism probably no longer can. But it's not clear to me the Kurds have that capacity either. So that's the first question. What is that nationalist ideology? Or what are some of its elements? And the second is sort of a point to all 3 panelists, and I don't want to be overly alarmist about this, but we spent a lot of time in 2012, 2013, 2014 building an expansive sense from Washington of what we would achieve in liberated areas of Syria, areas liberated from the regime. And in a sense, we built a kind of parallel universe of activities and aspirations and hopes and goals for territory where U.S. political commitment wasn't there. And we've seen President Trump's comments about restricting or ending military support to the SDF. We've seen his comments about his comfort level with Assad. We've seen his withdrawal of support reportedly to Syrian opposition groups. It doesn't seem to me that at the highest levels of the U.S. government, a commitment is there to do the broad range of things that each of you have spoken about. And so I hope, rather than creating a kind of, again, a new parallel aspirational universe, you could at some level address what does it look like if U.S. support isn't there?
Thank you very much. And actually, your second question and the last piece of it, I was going to direct to the audience as well, because in your discussion, there's an assumption about, I think I read two assumptions. One is that there will be a U.S. commitment to, or U.S. presence to support some of these initiatives. And second, governance by its definition probably assumes some democracy, and which may not be offered by, if the U.S. withdraws and an alternative of the Syrian government forces go back to some of these areas. But let me start with Hassan, since the first part of the question was to you, and address the second as well, and then come to Mona and then Nick.
I'll address Alex's two questions, because I think they are related in a way. So when I say national, I don't mean probably nationalist and the kind of the traditional sense, but national meaning it's not a group project. It's not a Kurdish or PKK project, but something that combines and includes all these ones. In fact, the SDF, when you talk to them, or the YPG specifically, they will say there are certain issues that they would like to talk about them as part of a national conversation. So maybe they are insisting on the decentralization or federalism, but eventually it has to be some sort of kind of consensus. It can't be this situation where I think a lot of people are expecting some sort of deal in the future, some sort of understanding with the regime. Some people say it will be by abandoning all the Arab areas and having the Kurdish autonomy. Some people say no, it will be turning all the American sphere of influence west of the Euphrates into some sort of decentralized entity. In fact, I think the Russians accept something like cultural autonomy, where people can just have their language and so on and so forth, but security forces and everyone will come back to these areas. For example, the SDF would say, or the PYD would say, they would say, for example, the issue of what we call in Syria the Arab al-Ghamr, or the Arabs of the flooding. Basically, this is back in the 70s when the regime displaced Kurdish families and a lot of Arabs from some areas and relocated them. So it was a demographic change in northern Syria to build an Arab belt so the Kurds don't have the kind of contiguous presence there. And a lot of these Arab families, the Kurds say they caused the displacement of tens of thousands of Kurdish people in that region. So they want to some sort of kind of correcting that by displacing Arabs again. Some people, some call for that. But if you talk to the PYD, they would say no, we want this as part of a national conversation. And obviously, because a lot of these Arab al-Ghamr, they are loyal to the regime because the regime sent them to Hasaka and these areas, right? So the PYD wouldn't go. The PYD wouldn't go against the regime in that sense. They wouldn't pick up a fight against Arabs as a kind of an ethnic cleansing, but also against the regime as going after their allies. So I think eventually the way I envision things is that at some point you need the return of the Syrian state to all Syria. And as a unified Syria is the best way forward. But under that, you could have something like decentralization, and I think the best way forward for that region is decentralization. And in order, I think the U.S. can have that as the exit strategy that everyone wants, which is basically a handover of this area to a Syrian state as part of a political settlement, not because of Iranian harassment and because they want to go because they're fed up. It has to be part of a political process, a settlement that they failed to do elsewhere in Syria, where they didn't want to support anyone. But now that you have a sphere of influence in Syria and that you have some leverage inside Syria, what you could do is that say, you know what, we're not tied to this, we're not wedded to this thing, but we want to rehabilitate these areas. We can help build local capacity and enable the locals to govern their areas and then hand them over and kind of allow them to become part of a Syrian state that is not Assadist regime sort of a state. So I think there's a way forward, and I think that's what I meant by national project.
Thank you, Hassan. Mona?
Thanks, Alex. If I could, I'd like to maybe just offer a couple points on your first question as well. I think it's important to acknowledge that the SDF did not start as a multi-ethnic force. I mean, this was really something, it was a bit of an artificial construct that had a very important Kurdish core, but an acknowledgement and a realization, for the very reasons we've discussed, that it would be important to accrete, to add more of an Arab membership. And so over time, the SDF has evolved, and I think in a positive way, to include Arab forces. And I would also take Hassan's point that there has been learning, or actually Nick's point as well, that there's been learning from previous experiences, and that the governance is, that the composition of the SDF is improving. But that said, I think we need to, again, be clear that this was not organic, and therefore, because it's not, it's also vulnerable. And it's vulnerable in different ways. So we've had reports of forced conscription, for example, amongst Arabs, and that's concerning. There's issues when Raqqa was first liberated, with posters of Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, up, and Kurdish flags, et cetera. These are, to my mind, those are concerns. That said, I think your question about people yearning or searching for a nationalist identity, and that's what's going to attract and sort of build legitimacy, I'm not sure that that's what people are looking for. I think that people on the ground are they're looking for security, they're looking for livelihoods, they're looking for, being able to live again. And here I think we need to be careful, because I do think the Syrian regime maintains inroads into these areas, has paid salaries, for example, throughout, even under ISIS control. And in the little survey that we did, and I underscore it's really more anecdotal, we did a little survey as part of the report. There's some interesting and I think somewhat disturbing results that came out of that. One was that 65% of those surveyed said that they preferred Syrian government influence over Raqqa to the SDFs. And related to that, an equally high percentage felt that the Syrian government would be better able to meet local governance needs. So I think that's an important red flag, or that frankly underscores why it is so important to have these alternate structures do well in providing for local populations. And to your second point, I share your concerns. I think that was part of the motivation of the report. I think that there is a temptation and a desire, perhaps, to withdraw. Our administration has talked a lot about not wanting to sort of be deeply engaged, certainly no nation building, reconstruction, et cetera. That's actually a carryover from the Obama administration, which made similar points. But I hope we've learned some of the lessons from what happened when we withdrew in Iraq. And I think Nick's characterization of the U.S. Playing this important role as a backbone really should be underscored. What's interesting and what's new, and what I think is really novel about our engagement, necessity is the mother of invention, and I think this whole model of by, with, and through that we've adopted on the ground in Iraq, but even more so in Syria, is really important. So we're talking about a light footprint. We're not talking about a huge U.S. presence. And the by, with, and through model can be adapted, and has, and is certainly also relevant to how humanitarian and stabilization and ultimately governance assistance is provided. So very light footprint, very much focused on, very nimble, very focused on local partners on the ground. That's, I think, critical. Last point, let's not forget the global coalition to defeat ISIS. And this is where I think maintaining that coalition is essential. Just because the military campaign is winding down, by no means is the job done. That if I could leave this audience with one takeaway, it is that. We should not seek solace in these military victories to believe that the Islamic State has been ultimately defeated. So the global coalition needs to evolve with those changes. Governance, to my mind, is the defining challenge in the post-ISIS landscape of Iraq and Syria. And it is going to be on the coalition, this multi-nation coalition, to think through and evolve in its mission to respond to that.
So I just would like to build off, and I agree wholeheartedly with both Hassan and Mona about this idea that governance is key. I'd also say, just in terms of the idea of a nationalist vision, I take Hassan's nuanced point on that. I think, it's incipient. This governance that we're talking about when we talk about the democratic federal system of northern Syria, it's so incipient. If you think about it, if we go to the time when the U.S. first began to engage with the EPG in the late summer of 2014, in the early fall of 2014, part of what made that, General Thomas was very blunt about saying it at the Aspen Security Forum in July, when he said, we asked them, do you have some Arabs? It has to be more than just Kurds. Luckily for the EPG, they'd had over a year and a half of engaging with various Free Syrian Army affiliates. So most famously, Kwa Sanadid, drawn from the Shamar tribe from Hasaki. They had worked with the EPG to capture the Yarubia border point in October of 2013, which is sort of one of those foundational moments. In fact, the EPG had been working with Liwat Raqqa, the Raqqa Revolutionary Brigade, which were displaced Raqqa fighters in the defense of Kobani, which is sort of the seed of the broader SDF mission. I would say that if you look at sort of the map that is created by the authorities in the democratic federal system, their concept of what's their core areas doesn't necessarily include Raqqa or Manbij or in Deir ez-Zor, for example. Those areas have been left out. So I want to raise the point about of conscription. That was one of the major areas of concern when you interact with communities that have been liberated from ISIS. Is the SDF going to bring their Kurdish intelligence agency, the Assayation? Are they going to tell us what to do? Are they going to arrest us at checkpoints? Are they going to force us to go fight for them? Are they going to force Arabs to die for Kurdish suzerainty? And I think, the SDF had some missteps in Tel Abyad. It had some missteps in Tabqa and Manbij, for example, when it came to, okay, now it's time we're going to conscript you. There was a pushback from local community, and now they've made that conscription not conscription. It's voluntary service for the civilian defense force. So I think this is an airplane that's being built in midair. I would say that to the point about can the SDF sustain itself without U.S. support? No, it can't. Just bluntly, the whole concept of the democratic federal system in its most expansionary sense wouldn't be there. You wouldn't have these sort of arrangements in Manbij or in Tabqa or in Raqqa. You wouldn't have a presence in Deir ez-Zor. What you might have is a more limited sort of concept of a federal system that'd be centered potentially in Afrin and in Hasaki. But again, the 800-pound elephant in the room is, of course, Afrin. One of the challenges, and the paper refers to how do you get to a sort of Turkish-Kurdish condominium in Syria. The problem is that just in terms of the practicality, the territory, particularly Manbij, but other areas west of the Euphrates, are a launching point for any type of connectivity to Afrin. And although Turkey has since intervened and has created a security cordon around Afrin, you can see in the horse trading after the war of a sort of secure access road from Afrin to Manbij, to Kobani, or further areas further east. So as the U.S. has placed this sort of governance mission on the SDF and has asked the SDF to evolve, and into this sort of governance authority, the constituent elements within the SDF have had to adapt and have had to assess, okay, how do we approach governance? We've had the commune elections that occurred 2 months ago. We have municipal elections that are scheduled for a couple days, December 1st. Potentially you have sort of the People's Assembly, which is sort of meant to be the parliament of the federal democratic system, that's supposed to happen in January. All of these are milestones along the road, but fundamentally, at this stage, without more U.S. support, or at least a U.S. commitment that, hey, we're not going to stay in Syria forever. That's not our objective, but we're here to build stability, interim stability, which is a phrase I've heard from the administration. We are going to use the U.S. investment in Syria as a way to get to a broader agreement to end the conflict. And then you can talk about bringing these areas into a larger national government structure, as Hassan alluded to. And without that U.S. support, none of this is possible. Fundamentally, without the U.S. involved in helping every step of the way, the partners on the ground, you are going to see these stress factors reemerge. And it is going to be difficult to continue to keep that conversation with the leadership of the federal system to get them to understand that there's a broader mission at play here.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, very quickly, because I think it's important. So obviously governance is important, but and key and everything. But I want to emphasize something else. If the concern is stability after ISIS, and you don't want ISIS to come back or Nusra to come back, especially in some areas where Nusra had a strong presence before ISIS came and forced them out, and they're still intact, as in still a viable force that can come back, and because they're locals, that's a real threat, especially in Deir ez-Zor. I think if that's the concern, I think more important than governance is legitimacy and security. Legitimacy meaning, the force that is there has to be accepted by people and shouldn't be seen suspiciously, even by some people, because when you talk to people on the ground, what their concern is, it never comes up. For example, that they are not happy with ISIS governance or with the regime governance or with the Kurdish governance, right? It's not about the governance. It's not what they talk about as a day-to-day concern, because they can sustain themselves. They're used to impoverished situation. That's not the more urgent thing. Obviously, that's important, and I think critical to for the legitimacy of any force there. But I think with the U.S., the kind of the deadly mistake, the Achilles heel of all the strategy, is that we get used to a model despite its flaws, and then believe that this model works because it works, because on that specific day it's working, and somehow, it's always already, as philosophers would say, as already good that way. They don't recognize the flaws that were present in that model. The SDF, like you said, it wasn't an organic effort. The forces that the United States relies on within the SDF are none of them. You can't single a person who could be an acceptable public face for anybody in that region. The Sanadid, for example, this guy, the leader of the Sanadid, he's respected among his tribe, among some of his tribe, right? But he's known to be a thug, and even the reputation is that he was kicked out of Syria or fled Syria because he was implicated in a drug case, right? At the time. And he fled, and he lived in Kurdistan, Iraq for the better part of the past decade. And then he fled and lived in Qatar before he came back after a deal with the regime. And then he started working with the Kurds. He didn't participate in the uprising against the regime. And then the people who they're working with now in Deir ez-Zor, the guy, if you ask anyone from Deir ez-Zor, they would say he used to steal motorbikes. He's that kind of a thief, right? So it's a band of thieves, and PKK. I don't want to be strong enough, but I think their model is working today because of certain conditions, and this, the obvious mistake here is that take, for example, two groups. One backed by the CIA and one backed by the DOD in Deir ez-Zor, right? Asud al-Sharqiyya and Maghawir. These are vetted organizations. Now ask yourself, why didn't the US-led coalition not cooperate with them to liberate Deir ez-Zor? Although they are local fighters. All of them are local fighters. They fought ISIS before ISIS rise. They were fighting ISIS, and a lot of them died because they didn't want ISIS to take over their province. They're vetted later on, so they're good guys supposedly, right? So why didn't the U.S. work with these ones and chose a motorbike thief, at least that the reputation of him, or the Kurds to come back there? Right? that's a bizarre thing to do, and nobody's asking these questions. Nobody mentions that in media, although these are hundreds of fighters capable, and Nick knows them, capable of taking some of these areas. And instead, we have the regime coming back in some areas because the United States didn't have enough forces to take Deir ez-Zor soon enough in that region. So I think we have to understand this model that we're talking about. I am positive about it today. I was critical about it because there are flaws. Iran is concerned about it. Locals are concerned about it, as in local armed organizations, people who are battle hardened. We're not talking about the majority of people, because the majority of people, historically, they accept anyone who comes and give them a chance, and then they work with them as much as they can. They don't rebel. Tribes don't rebel against anyone, right? The armed people within the tribes are the ones who are the more ideological and more like revolutionary than the tribal elders. And we've seen a situation that the U.S. officials know it. When you talk to them, they know this, but I don't know why they don't correct these flaws.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I know you have a two-finger on this, but let me take the next question and then probably combine the answer. The lady here. Next.
Hi, I'm Dee Parvaz with Think Progress. I have a couple questions. You all mentioned the importance of U.S. influence, trying to leverage what the U.S. has with the Kurds, trying to create governance, a system of governance that would somehow cherry pick and exclude the mukhabarat. But I'm wondering, given that, from the outside anyway, outside Syria, it looks like the U.S. has largely relinquished a lot of those roles there's been a lot of damage with the relationship with Kurds in terms of pulling back on arming them, in terms of how they dealt with the referendum in Iraq. And Russia has taken a lead with Iran and Turkey in its pocket, kind of dealing with a lot of issues on the ground, and the U.S. seems to be taking a back seat. So how does this look on the ground in Syria in terms of U.S. influence? What possible role can the U.S. have? And the next question is, moving away from ISIS for a second, say ISIS gets driven out of Syria and goes to, hangs out in Libya and Egypt and maybe a little bit in Afghanistan. This seems to be, when you have a country that's in such disarray, this looks like a prime breeding ground for a game of insurgent or terrorist, whatever word you want to use, whack-a-mole. So if not this group, then the next group. How can you provide security? How can a government provide security with all those sorts of things that the Syrian people want in terms of having rights, accountability, a system of government that was maybe slightly different than the previous iteration of the Assad regime before the uprising? How is that even possible?
Nick, we'll start with you. You had the two fingers up.
So thank you, and that's a very important series of questions. Just to quickly sort of respond to Hassan. Hassan is right, particularly in the context of the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, in terms of what we need to do is look at some of the more successful structures of the SDF that have been built over this last year-and-a-half campaign. So I would say look at the Raqqa Internal Security Forces, the RISF, look at the approach to building the RISF, which has had U.S. trainers and Jordanian trainers from the ground up. RISF is a very important potential model as we look at these areas that are outside of the core area of the federal system. Look at the Manbij Military Council. A form of legitimacy was built in Manbij to the point where you could actually have an expeditionary majority Arab force, the Manbij Military Council, that has been deployed to Raqqa, it's been deployed to Deir ez-Zor. So that's another type of model of group that you can build from the ground up. I'd also look at sort of the reforms within the Asayish and the internal security, where you have the Asayish that are drawn from the local communes and local communities. This is also another key area of reform that, if it is successful, will go a long way to building legitimacy in the broader federal system. So I would just say that, again, because we're talking about incipient governance structure and incipient security structures, there are some success stories that we should just highlight. I will very quickly, in terms of the role. I think it's been very clear the Assad government and its allies have been telegraphing now for about a year and a half, but particularly over the course of this last year, that they are going to double down on the narrative that the U.S. is an illegal occupier of Syrian land. That the initial reason why the U.S. was in Syria was because nothing was being done by ISIS has been proven. Their narrative is that it's been proven false by the advances of Assad and his partners in the Syrian desert in central Syria and in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, that the continuing U.S. presence in Syria is no longer about fighting ISIS, but is in fact about holding on to Syrian land and, more importantly, Syrian natural resources such as oil and gas, and in fact might even be a stealth strategy to work with Israel or whomever else in a conspiracy to eventually march on Damascus. And so we can expect, or I would assume that we can expect over the course of the next year and a half, depending on how long the U.S. stays, even beyond that, and you already see it. So the Assad government has maintained a satellite presence in Hasakeh, for example, or in Qamishli in particular, the northeastern city of Qamishli, which serves as a de facto capital of the federal system. It has tried to mobilize predominantly Arab tribal, but now increasingly also Kurdish dissident voices against the democratic federal system. And there you see very credible reports from people on the ground that I talked to of some flows of Hezbollah and other potential Iranian trainers into that area to try to create some sort of organic, natural response against the democratic federal system, but also to target U.S. I would say that I think the area that we should be really most concerned about right now when it comes to, how do you begin to see sort of a rolling back or conflict between the U.S. and Assad and Iran is in Deir ez-Zor. Secretary Mattis earlier this year referred to delineated zones of control all along the Euphrates River. We are seeing them literally being formed right now, and that is going to be a key challenge because with those delineated zones of control comes the reality that the SDF has now become the guardian or the steward of significant oil reserves on the north of the Jazeera side of the river, and that's going to be a point of contention and conflict. I will defer to Hassan when we talk about sort of issues when it comes to the renewal of insurgencies and militant Salafist and militant Islamist actors when it comes to Syria. I would just say that the situation in Idlib, or Greater Idlib, as U.S. government terms it, with the al-Qaeda affiliate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other potential new branches of al-Qaeda is a concern. I would say that when it comes to sort of worrying about insurgencies in the Syrian desert and Badia steppe areas, ISIS, and Hassan has written about this extensively, and I've analyzed it in different roles. ISIS is going to try to infiltrate these local security forces. They're going to try to infiltrate municipal councils. They're going to try to engage in what they call the management of savagery to tatter all the different elements that need to be built for stability, whether it's security, governance, administration, and just keeping people engaged in the post-ISIS administration. We should expect more of that. And on top of that challenge, we should expect more of Assad and his allies trying to build up insurgencies against not necessarily against U.S. forces, but also against U.S. partners to try to make it painful for the SDF and particularly those elements of the local population west of the Euphrates that have joined with the SDF. Make it painful for them to continue to engage with the Americans, because if those local partners in places like Manbij or Tabqa or other areas like in Raqqa begin to lose their willingness to continue to support the SDF and the U.S. mission, then we're going to see a sort of broader effect throughout that region.
Thank you. Mona, Hassan, do you have anything to add on this question?
Maybe just a couple points. I think I would agree with Nick's analysis, and I do think in particular that it is clear that the Syrian regime has very much signaled its intentions to double down on this, and by the way, backed by the Russians and the Iranians, who have also used similar rhetoric. So it's a real concern. I guess a couple things. One is, given all the challenges that Nick laid out, it's critical to manage expectations, obviously, what we can do. And I think what I've laid out, what I've been talking about, is really a short and, at best, medium-term strategy. But it is essential. I would go back, harken back to Hassan's points at the very beginning of this discussion about the windows of opportunity that exist. There is a window of opportunity right now, a critical one, for the international community to engage with, on these questions of post-ISIS governance in order to ensure against the emergence of an ISIS 2.0 or in order to ensure against other extremist groups taking advantage of power vacuums. Let's not forget that our primary national security objective in Syria as of 2014 shifted to defeating ISIS. And my point today is we haven't defeated ISIS, and we shouldn't take military victories to translate into that. Last point is, I think, let's also be aware that, again, one, the U.S. presence on the ground in Syria isn't completely insignificant. Now, open source reporting is suggesting as many as 2,000 special operations forces. Two, this by, with, and through model is really an interesting one, and it is a way to project power and influence using a light footprint in a very nimble way. It's the way in which the United States operated in Syria prior to the counter-ISIS campaign with respect to our provision of humanitarian assistance and stabilization assistance. So it's an interesting model that needs to be supported. I think we are in this critical moment, and some of the signaling to the SDF in particular that we might be withdrawing our support could flip them and result in the SDF seeing and reading the tea leaves and deciding that maybe better to put their fate in with the Syrian regime, which is not unheard of, and we've certainly seen instances of tacit cooperation. And that, I think, would be a real tragedy for this long-standing counter-ISIS campaign.
Want to add something? So I would say it would be sad, as the president would say, or the sad thing is that what the United States has to do in Syria is actually minimal. Nobody is asking the United States to send this many troops. In fact, all the previous proposals about a role in the U.S. involved more American leadership rather than sending 2,000 special forces. In fact, I think the initial policies and the neglect of Syria led to the sending of 2,000 forces. If a different policy was followed before, I don't think we would have needed 2,000 and plus American forces on the ground. I think I spoke earlier about the positive sentiments towards the Syrian democratic forces. I think that doesn't really have to do with the evolution of the SDF. It was really about how locals perceived increased American footprint inside Syria. That increased American footprint, that fact that the people started to see the United States as a savior, as a way to prevent the regime from coming to their areas and retake these areas with local forces and try to work with these. That perception, I think, led a lot of people to say, we want to work with Americans. We don't want the regime in Russia to keep bombing us and then take our areas. We want to work with Americans because we want to do what the Kurds did in their own areas, which is to create de facto safe zones, and as Turkey later did as well in those areas. So I think that staying power, that kind of footprint, that ability to say we are steering this process rather than the PKK, led a lot of people to say, this SDF thing is actually working. So it wasn't because the core of the SDF did something incredible. It was because of American role and presence in that area, using this strategy by, with, and through locals. I think that's very important. If the regime, I think if there's one thing that this administration has to understand is that this staying power is important, and it's the one that you should always focus on and should use like the next, say, 8 years or 4 years or 5 years to create an equity in that area that eventually would go back and be incorporated into a Syrian state, as I said earlier.
Thank you. Question here, and if there are any, we're at that point in time. If there are other questions, I'll probably take them together. But for here.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Rebecca Burkles from Save the Children US, and obviously this question is more pointed towards Mona, given your emphasis on education as a priority moving forward for the US government. So I wanted to know specifically what kind of mechanisms or paths forward do you see the US government taking to actually promote educational rebuilding and restructuring, whether formal or informal, in Syria? And also, if you could elaborate just briefly on your vision for this integrated aid and assistance packaging that you see being your recommendation in the report and as you mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Question in the back.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your time. My name is Lily Lusada. I'm a student at Georgetown's MSFS program. My question relates to the tribal basket. I'm wondering if you could first just explain a little bit more in detail about the threat of revenge killings that you currently see. And then second of all, if you could get a bit more technical on the sort of reconciliation, tribal reconciliation reform that you're proposing, and how you balance changing kind of tribal norms and tribal law like that with a light footprint approach. Thank you.
Mona, you want to give it a start?
Great. So let me take the first question first. In the paper, I think what I'm really stressing and focusing on is as we move in with our stabilization assistance, which is already starting to, again, to the extent possible, and I think we need to be very real about the extent of destruction, IEDs, et cetera, and the ability for people to return safely. But let's just take as an example the 3 neighborhoods that have, there are returns taking place in. That rehabilitating, refurbishing even, or creating safe spaces for schools is important, and we've done it elsewhere in Syria. We've actually had great success doing that in southern Syria. When I say we, I'm talking about USAID and other international donors. That kind of model should be replicated, working on informal education, ways to address the needs of these children, who many of whom have not been in school for 3 years, is critical. And my point really in the report is to say, this is as essential as traditional essential services of water and electricity. And then of course, and I know Save the Children, you all are quite familiar and quite good at this, but the importance of psychosocial support and addressing the trauma. I mean, there's so much sort of these invisible wounds that are so debilitating and that really have enormous implications for Raqqa's ability to stabilize and for people to be able to heal. And so again, those kinds of psychosocial interventions, which I think the humanitarian and development assistance community is already quite good about thinking about, but how important it is to ensure that those interventions are integrated across the board and that they're engaged upon very early on, even again with folks that are in IDP camps, children that are there, that these interventions need to be taking place now. I'll talk just for one moment on the tribal issues, and I know that Hassan is extremely well placed to deal with that. But I think you know, USIP has had a number of interesting experiences in Iraq working with tribes, and Sarhang is extremely well placed to talk about that. For me, it's an interesting question. Can we learn from those interventions, those very successful interventions in Iraq, including working on adapting and shifting tribal customs and tribal laws? Is there a way, and I don't have an answer, but it's more of an open question, is there a way to adapt some of those approaches to the Syrian context, and what does that look like? Particularly, again, understanding, as you rightly point out, you know, we don't have this enormous presence on the ground, but is there a way to maybe leverage some of our Iraqi partners to help train Syrians in some of these efforts? I don't know, but it's an important question that has to at least be on the table and be thought about. And for me, I think it's a good point, if I could, to make, I don't know if this is my concluding remark, but I want to just make sure I get this point in before the end of today's session, and that is, I really think it's important to understand that we are really in operating under a new model with a new set of challenges and circumstances with respect to our engagement in Syria. This is not about 160,000 boots on the ground, as was the case in Iraq, which, by the way, may not have been clearly the best way to do it. It's not about massive amounts of assistance and bags of cash being handed out. This is a completely different model that is, by definition, reliant on a small footprint, that is organic, that is heavily reliant on local partners. In my view, it may actually be a much better model and a much more sustainable one. But I think as we're talking about sort of managing expectations and what people are looking for, I think we're really looking for U.S. leadership, less about huge numbers of troops on the ground, very few actually, or huge commissions, a huge commission of resources. We're not talking about reconstructing Syria. We're talking about engaging in our leadership in order to help address some of these challenges going forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mona. Hassan and then Nick for last answers, and we each have 1 minute and a half. Sorry about that. We're at the end of our time.
So, as someone from Syria, from eastern Syria, I'm always pessimistic. Like, we'll propose these things, and we say the U.S. should do this and that. But I believe that eventually it will be either the jihadists or the regime who will win. It's not going to be the Kurds or the SDF or the U.S.-backed forces or the opposition. It will be either those those things. And it really relates to the bandwidth, political bandwidth and policy bandwidth of countries like the U.S. We know that eventually they'll leave, or they will have blind spots that will locals who work 24/7 rather than once a year on these issues on the ground and keep pushing for change and breaking down society. These are the ones who will win eventually. But on tribes, I think so. We have to, and this relates really to understanding the composition of that region. In the same way that Iraq, we failed to understand Iraq for a long time. Tribes, as you all know, I think, is the oldest institution in the Middle East. It has always existed there because there are certain things that ensure their resilience. Empires and countries came and went trying to break down tribes, and they couldn't, because the tribes immediately absorb whoever comes in, and then they adapt. Islam in the 7th century came in with a very anti-tribal kind of sentiment, but then eventually the first civil war was tribal, and then it was tribalized along the way after that. So I think we don't understand, just to kind of simplify it, for policymakers, people either say, tribes are very relevant or irrelevant. And I think the reason is because when they try to work with tribes, they fail, and they say, well, tribes are not really the fighters, and they don't influence the fighters, so we shouldn't work with them. But I think, and this applies to the Middle Eastern country, by the way. Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar tried to work with tribes, but they couldn't, because tribes require a lot of work, but they save you a lot of time and save you a lot of headache down the line. And the problem in Iraq and Syria is that nobody understands tribes, and even the people who are, like the current government is working with in terms of tribes, they have never lived in these areas. They don't understand tribes, but they are presenting themselves as the local tribal leaders or the Sheikh Mashayikh or the chief of all chiefs, right? So I think there is a lot of, that's a big blind spot, not only in Syria and Iraq, but in Sinai in Egypt, in Libya, in southern Libya, in West Africa. A lot of these areas, people don't understand the local context, and they are not willing to invest and spend some time there. If you don't want to spend some time to understand these things, then I think that the other choice is to just leave the whole region and decide that's too much headache. We don't want to work with locals. But if you are invested in this region and you want things to work your way, I think there has to be a lot of work done on this local level.
So just to very quickly build off of Hassan, we should, when we look at the SDF is Syrian democratic forces. The governance inspiration, democratic confederalism that was outlined by Abdullah Öcalan was a response to the fact that the Kurdish community in Qamishli was not even further massacred because of the intervention of the Shamar tribe. And because of that seed, Öcalan was inspired to talk talk about how there could be the possibility for different communities to interact. The people that are part of the SDF, they are Syrian. They understand tribes. They understand the role of tribes and tribalism because those are their neighbors. There are so many mixed communities in northeastern Syria that are multi-ethnic, and part of the component of those communities are tribal Arabs. I would say that if we look at the governance west of the Euphrates, the SDF has been far more elastic than it's given credit for. It has allowed space for order of tribal law. A good example of that is that the SDF has not imposed the type of women's rights legislation on these areas like Manbij and Tabqa and Raqqa that has been developed further east. And I would just say that one element that's very positive when we talk about governance and building local credibility is that on August 6th of this year, 23 suspected ISIS members that had been captured, that had been imprisoned by the SDF were handed back through the intervention of tribal elders to their families. And that is a sign of flexibility. I'll end on this point. This past July, General Thomas made a very important statement. He said about the SDF, they are doing something different and unique to every other surrogate that we have worked with in the last decade and a half. They are governing in their wake. They are providing representative governance. I would say that as the U.S. looks to build interim stability in the wake of ISIS, it needs to continue to provide support to allow the SDF to continue to build on that successful model of governing in the wake of ISIS.
Thank you very much. So just to conclude quickly, the key takeaways that I got from you is that we started with governance, and it is governance that gave us the space to have ISIS and the other terrorist groups. So that governance, regardless of who governs these areas, is important. That's the formula for stability and for preventing the return of ISIS 2.0 or another form of violent extremism. Second, that the local level matters. It's the local level, the bottom up, is critical for stability. Again, whether you have a national framework or not, those issues are there. And the third is that expect opposition to come from Iran, from the regime and others down the road. And if we want to prevent, that was a bleak scenario, Hassan, especially for the Syrians, say, okay, eventually you will have either the jihadists or the regime back. And I feel, I understand this is a realistic assessment that you're giving, but that is not necessarily not preventable. And I think this is where our role as international community comes in, is that how do we continue, and if we expect opposition and obstacles, are there ways to adjust to deal with those oppositions so that that bleak outcome of jihadists, for example, coming back is not an inevitable outcome. And second, the political process, I know we did not touch upon, there are multiple angles, as I mentioned, to discuss Syria, and these will be subject for separate events in their own right. But this was mostly about Raqqa and post-ISIS Raqqa, and what lessons do we take from those, and what light can they shed on what could be down the road. And this was definitely a rich and informing discussion for me. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent remarks. And thank you for joining us and staying with us. Thank you.